So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's lunch meeting. My name is Katarina. I work at Cradle, which is the research and development team of Breda University of Applied Sciences. And we are a partner in the DIGIREAL project, where we investigate three main topics, digital humans, digital social, and digital twins. However, today's meeting and next month's meeting is more focused on a new project which recently started. It's called VHESPER. It deals with virtual humans in psychology research, and it will run until the end of next year. We have next to us as coordinators, we have University of Bremen, Humboldt University of Berlin, and VHESPER, partners in this project. And today's lunch meeting, we have two speakers from University of Bremen and Humboldt University in Berlin, who tell you a lot about their work on virtual humans, especially in terms of psychological research. Just diving a bit more into the project VHESPER, we have three main tasks within this project. The first one is that we have the big ambition of establishing a European virtual humans network. We have already started gathering some contacts from all across Europe, and we have managed to compile a huge list database of who could potentially be a partner in such a network. So the project just kicked off, yeah, so we are really in the initial stages, but we are also shaping already some study designs for experimental studies on empathetic interaction, which we'll do together with the partners in the project that I mentioned. And after we have completed all of that, let's say, we want to develop some follow-up proposals, research and development proposals, to apply together with partners, maybe with all of you together, for European level proposals. And now I will not take too much time, but I would like to also tell you about next month's meeting before we start with this one, to remind you to sign up as well. We are going to have another meeting on the 30th of March on virtual humans, and speakers will be from VHESPER and Tilburg University. So they'll tell you more about virtual human and human interactions and how they train conversation skills using virtual humans. But now I would like to actually give the stage, the floor to our two speakers today. We have Professor Ursula Hess from Humboldt University of Berlin. She's a professor of psychology. And we have Dennis Köster, who is one of the research leads in the high-profile area of minds and media at the University of Bremen. They will introduce themselves larger, but now I would like to give the floor to Ursula. So, Ursula, if you can share your screen,
I will
be good.
Do that. 1 second. I'll share my screen and I start my thing. That should have worked if all went well.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so I'm Ursula Hess, and as was just said, I'm a professor of social psychology at Humboldt University of Berlin. So my task for today was to talk a little bit about how I am using or envisioning of using virtual humans in my research, in psychology research. And much of my research is focused on the influence of situational context on emotion communication. And here I'm really interested also in empathy in a wider sense. Let's put it like this. So just to give you a little bit of ideas what the sort of stuff could be that we are looking at, the core elements really are emotion perception, person perception, and emotional mimicry. So when we're considering context, also, I mean, context is a word that has a lot of different meaning. Sometimes it is used in emotion perception research to simply refer to the thing that elicited the emotion. But in fact, we are mostly interested in context in terms of the setting in which a presumed interaction happened, in the larger setting in which the emotion was elicited. So the larger setting is interesting to us because in most human contexts, our settings are highly normative. So there's a lot of implicit and explicit expectations about how people behave. For instance, here we're giving a talk. If I were to start to chant, you would think that probably very strange because it's not normative to give your talk singing, but conceivably I could. And so the idea is what sort of are the normative expectations that are associated with context, and how does that impact on emotion perception through the social judgments that people are making when they see a person behave in a given context. And those same effects also have an impact on person perception, that is, on how we perceive the person in terms of their characteristics. Is this a nice, friendly, intelligent person, or is this somewhat dubious person? Which goes into person emotion perception, as emotions are somewhat perceived differently depending on the expectations that we have with regard to the person. We have stereotypes for different types of individuals, and those can enter emotion perception. But what we mostly are interested in is looking at emotional mimicry. Now, emotional mimicry is this idea that people tend to synchronize, and in fact, they very often spontaneously imitate each other. So, for instance, I see two people going like this in the, and then one of them hides. Yes. What is this? Running, my example is running away from me. So this would be a very typical thing, that you are around a group of people sitting together, adopting a similar type of posture. But people also imitate each other's emotions expressions. And some of the research that I've done with Agneta Fischer from Amsterdam suggests that this is very much linked to empathy and the notion of being in an affiliative context. So in interactions where people feel positively about each other, they tend to engage more in mimicry. And so this is where the whole context comes in. So what does context do to either make it more likely or less likely that people show mimicry towards each other? Now, one of the questions is, because, I'm saying humans synchronize, the question is, do humans synchronize with virtual humans? That would be a question. We're still not sure whether humans synchronize with animals. I mean, actually, we've tried to do a couple of studies on that, but they were largely inconclusive. There is some evidence that dog owners yawn when their dog yawns and vice versa, but so it's not so clear that humans do in fact synchronize with non-humans. So the question is, do they synchronize with virtual humans? What's quite interesting to see is they synchronize with relatively sparsely humanesque things. So this is an older study from a colleague of mine from Würzburg, Peter Weyers, and his then graduate student. And what they were doing is they had these poser 5 avatars. And these avatars were either nice people or not. They were described as such. And then they could see that people would mimic the nice avatars, but not the unfriendly avatars. So these are seriously not very human-like, but you get the idea that it's supposed to be human. But in one of our studies, we found that people even mimic things like this, those very primitive drawings, provided they think of them as a social signal. So, for instance, in this study, when we told people that these were drawn by people who had a stroke and were suffering from aphasia, and we are now trying to find ways to communicate their emotions, then people would mimic these expressions very much. If we told them these were computer drawn, they would mimic to a much lesser extent. So, provided that these things have some social meaning to them, people do mimic them. So we felt that this was a good hint that working with virtual humans might help. And why were we working with virtual humans? Because we weren't doing that for the longest time. Well, as I said, we are interested in placing facial expressions, people showing facial expressions into contexts. And so in this study, for instance, we were interested in what's sometimes called expression deviance. That is when you show something that's unexpected in a context. So for instance, you just saw a picture of a wedding. We were using actually pictures of wedding and funerals because these are very, very normative, iconic situations. You're not supposed to laugh at funerals and to frown at weddings. So it's very easy to create something that's effectively deviant, and we wanted to know how that impacts eventually on mimicry. Now, what we did at the time was we did this. Let's see. So you see a funeral. Does that run? Yes, it does run. And then you see a person, and then you see a wedding, and you see a person. Where's the person there? And these are real faces, but you can imagine that this actually kind of works. It sets the people into the context, yeah. But you can imagine that this is really, really, really difficult to do. It takes an enormous amount of fiddling to fit the heads on the bodies, to make sure that the hair is cut out correctly and doesn't look weird. The timing of the different expressions is still different because these are humans and, they behave different, and the models do not always show the same expressions. So this worked really well, but it was enormously time-consuming to create these stimuli, and they were still not quite perfect. Let's put it like this. So what we'd rather like, we are now using a lot of meta-humans with Unreal Engine, and as everybody who has tried to use Unreal Engine knows, this is actually not making it much less labor intensive. It's just a different form of labor, but it does allow us to make sure that we have these different characters, and these different characters show the same expressions. Now, the problem is these expressions are fairly convincing, but they're not quite there yet. Yes. So, but people do accept them as smiles and react accordingly. But the advantage is these are truly the same expressions with the same timing, which is not so important in this specific case, but I have another case that I'll show you right now where it's much more important that they're really very similar. What we do here is we modify the expression. For instance, in this case, we were modifying the expression with gaze. I've done work in the past on modifying expressions with gaze, and it's actually really, really difficult to do unless you have a virtual human. I mean, you can't instruct people to show facial expressions and move their gaze in any reasonable way. And in the past, we always had to use stills where you could just see, one or the other, whereas it's really very interesting to see the dynamics of the gaze movement. And you get a different impression of the two people depending on how the smile and the gaze develop together. And that's a study we're currently running. But where it's really important that we have the same expressions is when we look at the effects of aging on person perception and emotion perception. It's pretty obvious that as we age, we get wrinkles and folds, which tend to often look a little bit like emotion expression. So for instance, if you look at this, you see here the eyebrows seems lower, which is what happens with age. And lower eyebrows usually give an appearance of being less friendly, less open, that sort of thing. So if you want to know something about the effect of age in terms of wrinkles and folds, it's really important to make sure that expressions are the same, because if different people show different expressions and you don't know whether it's the expression that makes the difference or the wrinkles that makes the difference. And older people have trouble with symmetry in their facial expressions. Facial expressions become more asymmetric, which tends to be problematic insofar as asymmetric expressions are often perceived more negatively as less honest and trustworthy, for instance. So we actually conducted a study a while ago, even so it was just recently published, where we took real people's faces with the real wrinkles and then put them on a mesh so that the expressions that we were then creating would be the same, because that was through the mesh and not through the face. This allowed us to create these people here, young and old, and in this study, we're focusing on person perception. So in this case, we hadn't yet added the facial expressions in that sort of first investigation we did. And for instance, as you may not be surprised to learn, older people are rated less positively. And what happens is that they're specifically rated as less attractive and as having showing more negative affect. Even so, these are neutral facial expressions. Due to the wrinkles, they're perceived as showing negative emotions, and that then has an effect on how people are perceived. So that's why we call this wrinkles are neither beautiful or nice. So, and for this sort of research, it would be nice to have, this is something we are running right now. It looks at persons of different age. These are the same meta-humans, we just aged them. And so we're looking at how they are perceived and how their emotions are perceived. So this allows us to make sure that what we're changing is age and not the person, which is important. So, and the other thing where it's really cool to have virtual humans is something that's sometimes called ensemble perception. This idea that you perceive emotions somewhat differently when you see it in groups, and that we also perceive group emotions. And with my colleague Kostas Kafetsius, we did the study on the sort of perception, influence of emotion perception influenced by groups. in 2011, and there we used these cartoons, yeah, which were drawn by a cartoon artist. Actually, the results are quite interesting. We then, with an enormous amount of effort, created a set of facial expressions where the surrounding two people had either matching or mismatching facial expression with the central person. But it's really difficult to do because we used emotion elicitation here, but people don't always show the expressions at the same time. Timing varies between people. So this required an enormous amount of filming, of editing, and in the end, we were not able to have dynamic stimuli because these things had to be like really cut together from different time frames, and it was not possible to actually synchronize those. However, in our research, and I think in emotion perception research much more generally, we have learned that it's much better if you have, in fact, dynamic stimuli, videos, which we can't create. So we are now working with these. These are just some thumbnails, snapshots, because they're not yet rendered, and that's why they're not moving. They are being in the process of being made, where we can actually, again, use meta-humans to create such ensembles, and then with matching and mismatching expressions, and then animate those, which is one of our goals. So, and another thing that one can do with meta-humans much better than with real humans is adding a voice, because it's really almost impossible to make humans separately manipulate their facial expressions and their tone of voice. But it is actually quite easy to do that.
The director of a large company is implicated in a major corruption scandal.
So,
the director of a large company is implicated in a major corruption scandal.
So, you can give them voices, and you can make those voices have different tone of voice. So this is another, I think, very nice possibility opened by using virtual humans. Now, obviously, these are still far from perfect, and also we don't even really know whether we want them to be perfect. So this is why I think it's very exciting to participate in this consortium and pursue an understanding not of just, so far just using the meta-humans as a tool is very interesting. But another question is to understand better how people react to virtual humans. And that's a question in and of itself, which I think is very interesting, and so which I like to pursue. And that was a lot. And that should have been 20 minutes on the dot.
Yes, thank you, Ursula. It's perfect. I will ask the participants to save their questions for later, because we do have another speaker, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the meeting. We have about 15 minutes afterwards. So please save your questions or write them in the chat, and then the speakers will answer them later. But now I would like to ask Dennis to, yeah, we see your screen, Dennis. It's perfect. So please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm a psychologist working in computer science, more specifically in the interdisciplinary high-profile area of minds, media, and machines at the University of Bremen, as well as in the cognitive systems lab with Professor Tanja Schulz. I will talk a little bit more about that later, but I have a lot of slides, and actually they are taking a look at one specific line of research I've been pursuing recently. Instead of this broader overview, I've been doing some things which are quite similar to what Ursula has been doing. We also published together in the past, but I want to highlight something where maybe the angle is a little bit different, and I still think this makes a nice addition to this. So I want to talk today about research we've been conducting on what is called EMG-based facial action unit recognition and animation. What that means is we want to recognize facial expressions not from video, as is the state of the art, but from facial electromyography, electrodes in the face. And ultimately, and we're working on that now, we want to animate avatars and virtual humans based on EMG input. But let me start at the beginning. Many of you may have Googled for facial expressions and emotions before, and if you just do this blindly, there's no way around Paul Ekman and basic emotion theory. And we talk about anger, happiness, sadness, and so forth all the time. I will also show you images, and of course Ursula has done that too, of people smiling and so forth. What I'm interested in is here not the part about basic emotion theory, where there's a lot that would need to be said to really explain what the issues with that are, what are the conceptual and theoretical problems with that. But I'm interested in the facial actions that can be recognized in the face, the muscles that people can move independently in their face. And Ekman, based on other work that he did not do himself, but he's famous for the facial action coding system, which is still the standard basis that people look at this today. So whenever you see anything in the media about facial expression recognition, you will see stuff that in some way relates to facial expression recognition by camera, typically by webcam. Decades past, trained facial action recognition coders would look at this frame by frame and need for 1 second of video like 100 seconds to code what that is. Nowadays, you can throw massive amounts of data at some of these even publicly available tools. Some are open source, some you pay for several thousand euros to get an output of which facial muscle movements can be detected from the visible movements of the face. Now, what we are doing here and what I want to do is actually connecting this not to the camera, but going back even further in time to previous century when Duchenne and others looked at electrical stimulation, and from which later developed research that also I know Ursula has been doing a lot. I'm doing a lot, in particular when you're looking at facial mimicry, at what are facial muscle movements that can be recorded on the surface of the skin of the face. And yes, I'm jumping a little bit through some of these slides in the background here. What is interesting here, and also gave me pause in reflecting about this, we are still doing this research with guidelines which are basically from the 1980s. People have been trying to look into some updates. There have been some recent studies trying to compare recording schemas, but more or less guided by anatomical knowledge, to some extent, I think, maybe not fully guided, at least not by recent work on anatomical knowledge. There are these guidelines on where certain electrodes have to be placed if we want to optimally record the movement of specific facial muscles. And this is very attractive, or this method is very attractive because it's very intuitive, and I think strongly argued for that if you actually put an electrode that records even faint activation in the muscle texture, in the musculature underneath, you should be able to get more accuracy. You should be able to detect even very subtle expressions. Like when we talk about mimicry, you're not likely to get these full-blown things with a huge smile and what we like to use as stimuli in psychological research when we look at context effects, for example. But we are interested much of the time in psychology in really, really subtle things. This can even be like in the Lang et al. Work on the International Affective Picture System, this can sometimes even be about relaxation below a baseline where there is very little activity to begin with. If you're looking at the muscles in the eyebrows, corrugator supercilii, and you show people pleasant pictures, you may have an effect that there's a relaxation. You know, you look at something nice and you go, oh, and you don't necessarily contract that muscle, but it might even relax. So I know of other people, Tanja Wingenbach, for example, who looks at responses to emotional words with facial EMG. Very, very subtle things that you do not always get, but it's a famous gold standard of the Laborie type of measure. That, however, is completely or largely disconnected from the full-blown facial action unit coding system. So you're looking at individual muscle sites. You can interpret them if you have sufficient electrodes in the face. You run into trouble because usually you cannot apply as many as you would like to. You do not get the full picture. And what is lacking there is action unit recognition, ideally for all of the action units based on facial EMG. And this I find very interesting. And what we want to do is push forward EMG-based action unit recognition, where we use machine learning tools and modeling to extract from a limited number of electrodes, ideally the full picture of what facial muscles are being activated. And ideally, we want to do this for very subtle expressions as well. And this has, I think, a future and application. And I get to some of the use cases, so I don't read all of the bullet points here. But major use cases I see is indeed if we're working with virtual humans, if we're working in virtual reality, specifically when people have other devices on their head, even though there's the empathic also, so there are prototypes that in particular also has been using that can record facial muscle activity even when people are interacting in virtual reality. But these things are fairly limited, but it's very interesting. So one thing we want to show at the end is that we actually want to stream from facial EMG responses to virtual humans and virtual reality. Another, I think, growingly important feature that you can have with facial EMG is that you really don't need the video anymore. So you don't have to sit in front of a camera, you don't have to threaten people's privacy. If you have facial EMG, you could use a different signal which still records the natural expressions without having to video record people. And yet another potential use case we see is improving some of the guidelines, having some engineering, computer science aid in actually, so there's a lot, if you compare this to EEG, for example, electroencephalography, you have these nice montages and amplifiers that allow you to see when you do mistakes, or at least when the contact between the electrode and the surface is poor, like for the entire montage that you're using. And this is still very crude, typically, when you're working with EMG, because it doesn't have the same medical standards. And yeah, there's a lot to do. And we think that applying some artificial intelligence and machine learning to that may help a lot. So we started with this a while ago, and it's also there was the way too big electrodes. I get to that later on. But this was born of the fact that these electrodes initially were simply the most usable by the bachelor master students we had started working with this. But what we did was, like for a very motivated student we had there in the beginning, who programmed a graphical user interface where we could show individual action units from a MPI bio, from a standard validated set of videos of professional fax coders or a fax coder who performed these, and then the instruction is simply to replicate the expression, because if you're a normal person and not a fax coder, and you're told to do certain expressions, you really need practice, you need some guidance, and we provided these, and also some feedback by an experimenter. So in the very first thing, we focused on just 4 action units, mostly in the upper face, also the AU9, the nose wrinkler, and looked at features that were relevant, basically using a time series feature extraction library was very successful for us, and then basic machine learning models that we compared from. Actually, random forest consistently turned out to be the most useful for us, so a simple machine learning model. With deep learning, we were still struggling at that time, but for that first pilot study, we got excellent results and nearly perfect recognition accuracy, sometimes or to a certain extent, even if we only recorded from 1 electrode site. So that was very encouraging, and we used that to go one step further and have a multi-user study. Those results we are still preparing and are not published yet. The other thing has been published. So there we have like really quite a massive database for EMG research, where 32 people came 5 times for 1 hour each and recorded over 10,000 trials, so that we have enough data. And we also have extended informed consent from 25 of those to share that data once it's fully and finally prepared. We made some improvements on the GUI. We placed the webcam that we have for control purposes, because we're excluding trials where the expression was not performed really well. And for that, effects coder and or a camera-based thing needs to evaluate how well this actually happens. So we try to place this in a spot in the screen. So not the typical on top of your screen, but really in front of the participant's face. We doubled the number of action units to record, including also a few more in the lower face, including also somewhat more challenging ones, so that you don't just have the smile, but also other movements with the lips, so making the task substantially harder in a way. We added also some questions on the self-report, because not all of these action units are equally easy to produce. Everyone can smile and understands if you tell them what you mean with the smile, but if you go back here and look at the chin raiser even, or you do the lip stretching, this is not so trivial, and we wanted to know, okay, actually, how frequently do people do this? Do they find this tiring? Is it easy or not? Very simple questions, which we found played a role. I have a slide on that later. So for this multi-user study, this is still what we call person-dependent models, so everyone gets their own model. We're also looking at person-independent models, which are then for if you train a model that then another person can use. Put very simply, we still got over 80% for the best models, even though this is twice the number of electrode sites. And we had to do, one other question is, if you want to put this into real time, is the window length. So if you need a lot of time for your measurement, whatever you do in the animation, which we ultimately care a lot about later, will come with a certain delay. I have an example at the very end where you can see that delay. We're still struggling with that a little bit, but yes, so there's some role of how much data and time you give to the model to train. And what's interesting is that in this, okay, I thought I had this, okay, I have this, okay, I have this 2 slides later, sorry. So you can already see that in the confusion matrix between the prediction and the reference, that certain things are recognized more easily, and we have a separation between the lower and the upper face, which is also plausible since these are more similar. There will be more crosstalk between these electrode sites, so they're harder to distinguish. Another thing, these are just pictures, is that this time we didn't use an expert, or this was in the first study, it was a student who really got deep into the matter and practice until he got every action unit perfectly. These were naive subjects who came in and just got the instructions, and sometimes they managed, and sometimes they did not manage so well. Which, however, is also interesting because in any real-world application, you will not have trained fax coders, but you will have normal people, and they will try to express whatever it is they are trying to express in their faces. So we found a lot of variation in how easy they found this. Obviously, doing nothing is always the easiest and least tiring, so that's not so interesting. But some action units, like action unit 20, are a lot more tiring and less frequently used than the smile, for example. We could drill further into that, but there's like a whole range of what can be said about how easy or difficult people perceive this task, depending on what they were actually asked to do. And what's then interesting is if we included that into our selection of trials that we counted as good, and where participants then said, yes, this was easy, this was difficult, include those. This also made a certain difference to our overall recognition performance. So if they had opportunities to do things again and try again, but if they found that they did not perform so well, also the model had more trouble classifying this, even though it still worked reasonably well. Okay, so here are what I already said. We have these clusters of confusion in the upper and lower face, which makes sense. If you collapse that and say, yes, there is an eyebrow movement, even though we cannot distinguish whether it is the inner or the outer eyebrow, then we again get substantially better overall results. Okay, now I still have a few more minutes. And the third study that we did more recently, there I got more and more annoyed. We're using these huge electrodes. This is not what you're supposed to do according to the guidelines. And for subtle things in particular, the smaller 5 millimeter discs, 1 centimeter total diameter should be better. So we talked to the manufacturer, Plux, in Portugal, and they made us an adapted version of the amplifiers where we can plug in whatever electrode we want. So we used then we did a study where we compared then using the same amplifier, the exact same settings, the same hardware, except that we switched out the big electrodes with smaller electrodes, and we will likely continue to do that. And then counterbalance this across upper and lower face, doing these expressions again, and doing sort of a 2x2 design where we looked at the size of the electrode in combination with the intensity of the expression. So here we really want to see facial EMG should also be good for very subtle expressions. So we came up with an instruction in half of the trials for participants to do the most subtle but still feasible version of that expression that they saw. So they do it once like usual, the apex type of big expression that should be easy to recognize, and then they try to do a very subtle expression that is still activating the same muscles, with the idea that maybe the smaller electrodes in particular could be good for the more subtle ones. That then means that we have 17 classes all of a sudden, which is vastly more challenging because we're looking at a lot more. And our participants, there are limits on how long we can ask them to be in the lab. So because they did a lot more, they could do a lot fewer iterations. So this is basically a single trial case, which did not work as well as the other things. But considering that it's 17 classes, we still got quite encouraging initial consistency and accuracy in detecting and separating these expressions. What is perhaps more interesting is that it also looks like we get an interaction, in fact, between electrode size and expression intensity, suggesting that roughly smaller electrodes may be more suitable for the low intensity expressions. But it could also be that the big electrodes, because they have the sticky EKG type of tape and they never come off and they never lose contact, they are on there once and stuck, have advantages when people are actually doing these overblown, prototypical big things. So we did get somewhat better results for the big electrodes when we were doing those, even though my heart would be to move forward and push forward with the small electrodes. And we have some follow-up results that show improved results for the small electrodes. So I get back and should conclude soonish on the use cases. And I want to highlight the one that is perhaps the most relevant for the virtual humans, and it doesn't look great yet, but this is still the idea. So we have a student here, and you can see the delay, and he is smiling, and then the avatar smiles, and we're trying to, or the virtual human smiles, and we're trying to extend that. And of course, would be interested also in making this work for as realistic avatars or virtual humans as possible. Because, and I think I still have that slide there, like with another student project. And yes, these are all pretty, they differ and so forth. So one thing that is maybe noteworthy, even though people will respond, like Ursula showed, even to caricatures, or they get what the picture is supposed to mean in terms of impressions and respond to that. It doesn't mean that recognizing expressions in avatars is always completely trivial. So we do see some differences in if we ask humans to rate expressions shown by avatars in varying degrees of quality. So here we had character creator, make human, humor, and blender type of avatars. This isn't perfect. So we cannot assume that even so I think what Ursula puts a lot of effort in making all the expressions look nice. So it may not matter so much how many polygons or how good the texture precisely is, but you really need to have the expressions right. Otherwise, people might not perceive the action unit you're trying to portray as that action unit, even if you try to make it as easy to them as possible by showing it, we use these actors and then just had to click which expression matches this. So yes, that's the goal. And I think with that, I've reached the time and given you an impression of this line of research and what we're trying to do there and why virtual humans are really exciting there. Okay, I can have maybe this one slide to summarize this. What we're trying to do at the Cognitive Systems Lab is, while I'm also super interested in highly standardized psychological paradigms and social context in particular, this whole thing becomes so much cooler, I would say, so much more interesting if you can have an interactive system with the human in the loop and the biosignals they produce being automatically recognized, and then having an interaction partner that is also responding to that in a pre-programmed or predetermined way. That is sort of the even wider vision of tying this into what we're doing at the Cognitive Systems Lab more generally. Okay, that I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. So I would like a round of virtual applause for both of our speakers. Thanks to both of you. It was really interesting. But now, because we have 10 minutes, I would really like to use the time for some questions from the audience. So please, if you have a question, I'd say just honestly unmute yourself and feel free to ask. Yeah. I see Igor raised a hand. Or no? You didn't. You clapped. Okay. So if anyone has a question, please raise it. I see Kayana, you wrote something in the chat. Maybe, yeah, if you want, you can speak up.
Sure. Thanks for these presentations. I wrote it in the chat as well, but I recently started a project and that's really focused on nonverbal mimicry in human-virtual human interaction, which seems very related to what you are doing. And well, currently I'm at the starting stage, so I'm doing a scoping review to see what kind of empirical research has been done with regards to nonverbal mimicry and virtual humans. And I will present that in the next DIGIREAL meeting as well. But after that, I plan to do an empirical study myself, do some experiments. And I was just wondering if you would be up to have a short discussion with me when I am designing my experiments, because you are a lot more experienced and you have the expertise. So I was just wondering.
Sure.
Sure, yeah.
Ask away. I mean, you can easily have my email. I think it was easily available, and yeah, just send me an email and we can talk.
Thank you. I will send you an email.
So can I respond to one of my, yeah, okay, already. I see the question in the chat, but yeah.
Yes, because I'm curious, because what you're actually measuring is the what changes in the muscles, what causes the effects on the surface of the face. So it's more fundamental. That's really interesting, but it's also difficult in any situation to really put a lot of electrodes on people. So I'm curious, does this lead to deeper insight in the facial expressions, and could this improve also the cameras use to measure facial expressions?
Well,
okay, one thing is you can, of course, try to combine these. In machine learning, people like to fuse modalities and data from different channels anyway. So you can do video and audio. So if you have some of the experiments that Ursula showed, there's also emotion portrayed in the voice. And of course, you can, if you have the electrodes, if they have big electrodes in the face, they might interfere, but you can try to fuse these together to better solve the pattern matching part of emotion recognition research. The deeper insights, there you really need the context. It depends on what context can you use what tool. And I think there are contexts where you do not want to use the camera, and there are contexts where you're really interested in the super subtle stuff. And the EMG, if depending on how this progressive, maybe sometime we could have a measure, there are people trying to put motion sensors in the ear and apparently get somewhat useful results. So maybe, I don't know, I don't fully believe that, but definitely, as with any engineering task, eventually you get it more convenient and better placed, and that opens the door for more use cases, so to speak. But
I think it's also important to note that it really measures not quite the same thing, the camera and the EMG. First of all, the visual, we always say, oh yeah, this is zygomaticus when people smile. Sure, it's likely to be zygomaticus. Actually, some people don't have a zygomaticus major, they can still smile. You can use other muscles for that. It doesn't quite measure the same thing. That's the first thing. In many applications, that is totally irrelevant because you're not interested in those subtleties, but you just have to keep in mind that do not actually measure the same thing. And the other issue is that you can actually have quite a bit of muscle tension before you see anything. And now that also depends on the face. So if you have more fat under your skin, so for instance, we always talk about the wrinkles around the eyes, yes. Now, if you look, children don't have those. And many young people don't have them either because what we often call baby fat, a thicker layer of fat under the facial skin totally obscures that. But it's not only baby fat that does that, as any fat does that. So depending on your facial structure, some things may not be visible, even though there's definitely a muscle reaction. So now if you're interested in simply the reaction part, EMG cannot be fully replaced by cameras. And during the pandemic, for instance, we have done a number of studies, which we also published, where we measured mimicry using open face, so camera recordings and then open face. That works just fine, but you have to understand, you only get the visible part of mimicry. And people may often react in subtle ways because they're reacting, and that reaction you can measure with EMG. The communicative part, the part where other people will also notice that they react, that you can get with cameras. And again, these are somewhat different things. And if you, depends on what you're interested in, and some of the research that Dennis was describing, it's really important that you get what you can see. And then cameras obviously are brilliant for that. Yes, they're much better than electrodes, because as Dennis was saying, when you get too intense, you run into all sorts of problems with your electrode measurements. Yes, but when they're very intense, they're really well measured by camera. So there is an overlap, but actually it's different things.
Yeah, and I think it's really a sort of a niche or an interesting possibility now to use some, because automatic exchange recognition with cameras has been done for decades, and there the questions are really when is this meaningful in the context? But like, even if you want to have a more private context where you don't film people, that's obvious, or where you have a more multimodal or in the wild type of situation where for other reasons you cannot really place the camera, or if you're looking at these subtle things which are not then visible, or visible things that also include subtle parts somewhere that people would not see, then it's simply a methodological contribution that I find very interesting. But of course, what applies to both in principle is that the biosignals driven interaction is something that I really care about, and that I think Ursula's also going towards when she says use dynamic stimuli instead of still images. We want to use, I think in this project, we want to use, well, maybe we may also use still images and videos, but it would be really cool to have like at least short controlled interaction sequences between virtual humans where we can synchronize, also you showed nicely the eye gaze movement with the, and I fully agree with you. But of course in VR we can even go one step further, right? So we can create a dependency dependent on what actor 1 does. Let actor 2 do this, and then you're talking. Then you can do cool things. So
and you can
that's where I want to go.
Things.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have maybe time for one more question from the audience? Do we have someone else who wants to? Oh, I see, Marielle. Are you able to unmute yourself and say, or should I read out your question?
I think I can read aloud. It's very interesting on the differences between like muscle stimulation and the camera measuring. I sometimes am frowning and I don't even notice I'm frowning. And even if there's then my layer of fat that doesn't show my frowning. So what is there a threshold in what like muscle tension to what I myself would even notice before others see it? Just out of curiosity.
You would not, yeah.
There's some research on that suggests people are generally speaking lousy at the task. We also have done some research which suggests that people are generally speaking lousy at the task. We don't get very good proprioceptive feedback from our expressions, but we also don't pay proper attention.
And you can train that if you want.
Yes, exactly. You can train that. And it is also the case, if you think about mimicry in general, that it is open to awareness, but usually you are not aware. So for instance, classically, you may sit around a table talking and, you know, there's like 3 people sitting like that in a row. And suddenly they realize that they're all in the same posture. So that's what I meant. It's open to awareness. You can totally realize that. Very often people don't.
Yeah.
So,
many years ago, sorry, I was like in a clinic doing my internship as a psychologist, and my task was to people with headaches, chronic headaches, do biofeedback training so that they stop having so much tension actually in their forehead, and there would like be a tone, a rising tone if they contract this, and then learning to recognize what you're doing and relaxing. And okay, there are these, and what one way, if you can recognize it as a low threshold, of course, something like that is also possible even in the virtual human. You could just say, provided you recognize it well enough, amplify it by a factor of 10 in the visual. So you can play with that if you want. It's just
interesting. Thank you.
I would like to thank you all for participating, to the speakers for their wonderful talks. And in the meantime, I would like to wish you a lot of success with all of your work. And have a nice day.